Hello, and welcome to the first class of developmental neurobiology. This is meant to be a quick overview of the human nervous system. But before we start, I would like you to think in a more simplified way. We would like to again, look at the purpose from the beginning. If you go and Google Sophie the robot, you might be familiar with her. And especially the video where it says Sophie the robot who wants to destroy humans. Just Google it. It's a 2.5-minute video or so. And it will enable you to see things probably in a different way. I mean, to see the nervous system, to see language, to see how we human beings are made and constructed. Of course, the human being is very complicated. We cannot understand even, a small percentage of ourselves. But generally, we would like to understand in a simplified way the difference between brain, mind, and body, and the relationships that connect them to make them all function together. So when you think about the body of the robot, Sophie, the robot, it is exactly the same way as this skeleton on the left side. They structure things. And there's a shell. That's the skeletal framework, the shell. So that shell cannot do anything on its own. And of course, in order to make it move and stuff, you have to make connections. You have to add muscle to that, and muscles contract and they can make us perform. But that is not enough either. You can have a body that has muscles, and it has bones, it has all the skeletal structures, but there's nothing to move it, nothing to make it actually do anything at all. So what makes the difference then is the mechanism that's inside, that controls that shell, that controls that body, and makes it do things. For example, that makes that body move from one place to another, move limbs, arms, legs, and more importantly, that makes that body have a purpose, have intentions, have ideas. So all of this comes from the brain. And there's nothing at all that is possible without the nervous system. There is nothing that you can imagine any human being to do without the nervous system. So that nervous system, to me, that part of that nervous system looks like the person who is inside of the Barney suit. In order for that Barney suit to be animated, to look like a person that you could forget, for example, about in terms of the appearance and stuff like that. When you spend a few moments watching Barney, you forget that it's a suit that someone is wearing and someone is inside and moving that suit left and right and talking and stuff like that. So you have a shell, the body, and then you want it to do things. You want it to move around. You want it to think, to plan, to, all of these functions. So the brain now is the central piece that controls the entire body in terms of its function and even anatomy and everything. But how do you get the brain that's in the skull over there to have control over different distant parts of the body? Well, it makes sense to make wires, to take cables from that brain and to connect that, wire it like any electrician would wire a building or a room or the robot, Sophie. So you send the cable down, through the trunk. And out of that cable, then you take branches and send them to the arms so that the arms can move. And more importantly, you want to get feedback from the arms and the legs and different parts of the body so that you can make sure that they are adjusted, that they do what you want them to do, that they are alive. So that nerve, that branch that you take out of the spinal cord and send to the arm to innervate the arm, for example, and the digits and all of this, the purpose of it is to make you move and to bring sensation from whatever you touch, from whatever is happening in the environment in terms of pain, temperature, for example, different kinds of sensations and feelings that you can get from the environment. All of this will travel through the nerve to the spinal cord and then goes to the brain. And then you figure out, what do I want to do with this information that I'm getting from the environment? These extensions, again, also many of these extensions go inside of our trunk, inside of our internal organs. And they give us feedback about how we feel inside. So the basic purpose of the brain and the entire nervous system is to control the body, to make it do what needs to be done so it can maintain itself, to feed itself and to maintain its own safety and own health within the environment that is in. The environment is full of dangers, and you need to make sure that you maintain that body and the parts. So, for example, you have pain, and pain is a kind of messenger that tells us there's something wrong you need to fix. So, again, the nervous system, the core piece of it is the brain. The spinal cord comes down as a cable that goes down so that you can take out of that major cable branches and send them to every part of the body so you can control that body and you can get sensation and information from the environment outside, and you can get sensation and information from the environment inside of the body. So this way you have optimal control and over the body, and minute by minute, second by second, you are able to monitor its condition and make sure that it functions the way that it should. So that's in a nutshell the function of the nervous system in general. Once you take that piece out, once someone is declared brain dead in a hospital, there's nothing. They can't do anything else. That's it. The body is just laying there, and in no time, it just gets recycled and it goes. So, with this in mind, we look now at the brain and the spinal cord as the central nervous system. And the branches that get out of the brain and the spinal cord are the peripheral nervous system. It's just like your computer processor. That is the central piece, the processor, and anything that attaches to it, like the mouse, the keyboard, anything else, the microphone, all of these are peripheral things that go attached to the central piece. So here is the brain. Of course, as it is sitting here, it is kind of, falling down. But in the skull, it is held in a certain, position so that the center of it, as you see here, is lifted up, and it makes a deep groove between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. But here it's kind of slouching because the tissue doesn't have much to support it in front. You can see that little casing outside, which is almost like a cellophane. That is the pia mater that wraps the brain and covers it and kind of holds it. It's almost as thin as the layer of an onion that separates a cortex of the onion from another, that little white transparent thing. And you can see the spinal cord, the cerebellum is here. So would like to give an overview of the nervous system in general, so that when we study the development of the nervous system, we know the basics and the functions of it. I do understand that all of you have a good background about the nervous system. This could be a refresher. And if you haven't for a long time gone back to this information, it will not be too complicated. So it will serve as an introduction for us. So when we go and study next week, we begin looking at brain development, then things will, we have something to attach the information to. So the nervous system includes everything, all the cells in the body that have the function of transmitting information to other cells, of communicating with other cells in the body. And what makes it special too is that, say you have a neuron in the brain, and that neuron wants to send the signal way down to your toe, to your big toe. That's a huge distance, yet you can do it. If you just think, oh, I want to move my toe, you can, and then you have the intention, and then you get these neurons in the motor cortex, and they are going to fire so that the signal goes eventually to your toe to move it. So the central nervous system tissue, neurons, they can communicate across long distances. Other cells of the body, yes, they can communicate. However, they have to be close to each other to have chemicals flow from one to the other to bring messages. But cells of the nervous system can communicate with each other. They can communicate with muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is not nerve tissue, but nerve tissue, neurons can communicate with muscle tissue to make muscles contract to move things. And they can communicate with glands, like say to secrete certain things on the skin to make your skin moist and all of this. Communication, it is all about communication. The whole function of the nervous system is about communication, getting information, bringing it into the brain and the nervous system, and bringing in motor orders from the brain, sending that down to move body parts. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Everything else that branches out of these two is part of the peripheral nervous system. When basically these are 12 cranial nerves that have origins inside of the skull, and they get out, innervate our facial, musculature, and the inside of our pharynx and oral cavities, and all the structures in our face, and the neck, and then the shoulders, and then inside of the abdomen, stomach, lungs, and so on, heart. And then as you go below the level of the cranium, you are going to have the spinal cord. Just that spinal cord goes down through the spinal column, and that is part of the spinal cord itself is hanging down from the brain, and it is part of the central nervous system because it's continuous with the brain. And then out of the spinal cord, you are going to have spinal nerves that go into the arms and the trunk and the legs and everything. So we are going to look at the different structures and then go with a little bit of detail, not too much detail. So here is the central nervous system includes, I mean, we said the brain, but we look at parts of the brain. It consists of the brain stem, and then, so the brain stem is this part from the base of the skull here, and you go up to these two pieces here, not like the egg structures, but the pieces next to them, which are actually below. So this is the brain stem. Sometimes the midbrain is classified as a piece by itself. This is why in your slides it says the following 6 structures, but if you add the midbrain and one more of the structures here, each one is going to have different parts. You are going to have 7. However, it doesn't matter of us, the number doesn't matter, but we just look at the pieces themselves. I even took the number out here. So in terms of the spinal cord, there's nothing that separates it, the spinal cord, from the brainstem. The only thing is that the base of the skull has a hole called the foramen magnum. And what's above that, what's inside of the skull, is part of the brain. What is beneath the skull is the spinal cord. But they're continuous with each other. So you start with the brainstem, all this green part, and the brainstem consists of the medulla, the lowest part, and then the pons, and then the midbrain, this structure here. And you notice a piece that is cut here, that the cerebellum extends behind the brain. You can see it up here, the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is like a little brain that has all the cables from it coming out into 3 big cables, all the output from it. And then the middle cable goes out around the brainstem and hugs it to make the pons, this. And of course, it becomes part of the brainstem itself, the extensions from the cerebellum. And then 2 other branches. One goes up to connect with the cerebral cortex. That's called the superior cerebellar peduncle. And then one goes down, the inferior. They are not shown clearly here. The inferior goes down to go into the spinal cord, and it becomes part of the spinal cord. So this is how the cerebellum then connects with the rest of the brain and the spinal cord. So you could see now, if I say, is this brain looking left or right? Is this the front or the back? Then this will be the front, because the cerebellum is in back of the brain. The cerebellum will be here. And of course, again, the arms, the peduncles are cut. So, and it is moved, but this is the front of the brain, the front, and this is the anterior, and this is the posterior. Here's another view, and it shows how the cerebellum is, and again, how the peduncles are cut. So let's speak a little bit about the spinal cord. We're not going to cover it extensively here. We might refer to it later at some point in the course, but we are going to focus a lot on the cerebral cortex and the brainstem. So the spinal cord, again, is an extension of the brain. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it is divided into 4 pieces based on the piece of the spinal column that it goes through. So the spinal column has, vertebrae, and each vertebra has, in back of it, has a hole called the spinal canal. And the spinal cord is threaded through the spinal canal, So when you have all the vertebrae organized together, stacked on top of each other, each one has a hole, and these holes are exactly aligned, and the spinal cord is threaded through them all the way down. And we call the different pieces of the spinal cord based on the piece of the spinal column that it goes through. So this piece the vertebrae, 7 vertebrae that make up the neck piece of the spinal column, these are called the cervical vertebrae, C1 through C7. So that piece of the spinal cord also is called the cervical segment of the spinal cord. Then, in the thorax, once you start inside of the thorax, then we have the ribs coming out of the vertebrae in the back of the vertebral column, 2 ribs coming out from each side, and then each vertebra, and then they curve around so that they connect with the sternum in the front of the chest. And then we have the lower ribs but again, I don't want to go too deep into that anatomy. The idea is the piece of the spinal cord that is threaded through the vertebrae that make the back of the thorax. This segment is called the thoracic segment of the spinal cord. And then the piece that is below, we call it, the lumbar area, L1 through L5. We call that also the lumbar segment. And then the piece that is below is called the sacral segment. Beyond that, at that stage, the spinal cord splits into actually 3 pieces. One piece innervates the torso, the torso, and then the other 2 major pieces, cables, go down to the legs. And then now, this way you have reached out to all parts of the body. And if you look at a segment of the spinal cord, as I mentioned, exactly like you are wiring, some kind of, a robot, a car, a building. So you have that major cable, and out of it you make branches to the different parts that you want to communicate with, the parts that you also need to have control over. So these are the main functions of the spinal cord. They are primarily 2 main functions, and there's another function I'm going to mention. One second. So the first function is to allow communication between the cortex on top of the brain and the rest of the body, the lower extremities, the trunk, the arms, and everything else. When we say motor functions begin with the brain on top, with the cerebral cortex. You have to have an intention, a purpose to move, and you send that command down. So then you also want to get information, feedback from these structures, muscles, tissue, skin, and so on. And that goes up to the spinal cord and then goes up to the brain. But in some cases, you give the spinal cord local control over movement, over reflexes. So, for example, the knee jerk, when the physician hits your knee cap, then your knee is going to jerk. That is a reflex. A reflex is a quick action, usually motor action, that doesn't involve thinking. It doesn't go to the brain to be processed and all of this. It needs to be processed locally. And the closest area for a reflex to be processed is in the spinal cord. So there are some reflexes that have to do with movement, and reflexes that have to do with the foot, for example, reflexes that have to do with the toes, These are mediated locally in the spinal cord, so that they have to do with survival or things like that. And you need to have a very fast, very quick reaction. Like if you have your hand, you're sleeping, and obviously not consciously thinking about something, and then something pricks your hand or your finger. What do? I mean, we involuntarily, your arm is going to withdraw. That is the withdrawal reflex. So that reflex, you might be, what is causing the pain could be maybe a scorpion stinging or a snake biting, or something that could threaten life. So immediately you don't have the luxury of sending the information up to the brain to be processed and all of this, and then come back and say, here's what you do. No, you give local control to the spinal cord. So immediately if you touch something hot or something sharp or something that is harmful, and all of a sudden your arm is going to withdraw, because the information travels quickly through the sensory nerve and it goes to the spinal cord. And immediately the spinal cord sends the message back to the motor system to withdraw, to contract your muscle, to withdraw your hand from the source of danger. So again, the function of the spinal cord is to channel motor information from the cortex down to the organs, and to send sensory information up to the spinal cord and to the brain, and also to mediate, to be the control center for spinal reflexes, like the knee jerk, like the fanning of the toes, we call it the plantar reflex, and other reflexes that you don't have to study. Now we look at the brain stem. When you think about the brain and the nervous system, how it develops, it just develops like a tree does. The tree trunk, the outermost layer, as you know, is the newest layer. Every year, as the tree adds a layer, it is the outermost layer, and the oldest layer is inside. The brain, when it develops, and the nervous system, when it develops, the newest layer is going to be formed, the cells will exit and then go out, migrate to form the new layers. So the brain stem is the oldest piece of the nervous system, the brain stem. And it is focused, the main functions of it is to preserve our lives, to do our primitive functions, the primitive functions of the body. And it can keep you up, it can keep you alert. Not asleep, in other words, but more importantly, it keeps your heart running, your breathing mechanism running, your blood vessels dilating and regulating your blood pressure, your stomach running, and so on, bladder. All of these functions that you have no control over, the autonomic nervous system functions that you have no control over, they are primarily controlled by the brain stem. It is the primitive brain. And we share this with all animals. All mammals, basically, they have that structure to maintain their body, to make their body animated, and to run the mechanisms inside of that body. The cortex is what makes all the difference for us, what makes us humans. But this is, again, the brainstem. When you think of it, you think about not necessarily thinking, you're thinking about basic life functions, vegetative functions of the body that you cannot survive without. The other things could be luxury. And, when you come to survival, the other things are luxury: thinking, language, cognition, emotions, and so on. But this, the brainstem, is survival. And you could now appreciate, you could now know that when someone has a car accident and their head jerks forward, jerks back, and forward again, it is like, it could snap like a carrot. And if the brainstem is affected because of all these centers, the person will go into coma, the person will have difficulty breathing, and the heart rate will be very irregular. A lot of, it could lead to death immediately if the impact, of course, is great. But in the other scenarios, it could be coma, and the level and the severity of the coma it depends on how much damage is in this particular area. There is a structure that I'm going to mention shortly. I hope you can see it. It's like a worm, goes from the top and spans all along the the brainstem. From the lower here, goes up, 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 just like a worm. That is called the reticular formation. Reticular formation. You can Google some images of it. It makes its own neurotransmitter system, and it is really critical. It has critical functions that I'm going to speak about in a minute. So the brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata and the pons and the midbrain. So medulla oblongata, that lower piece, and the pons and the midbrain. In addition, so the brainstem, in addition to being a cable that carries motor input from the cerebral cortex and carries sensory output from outside and lower parts of the body, in addition to that, it has clusters of nerve cells, of neurons that are there to control internal body functions. As I mentioned, you have a center here, cardiovascular center for regulating heart activity. You have respiratory centers, one here to control the rhythm between inhaling and exhaling, and another one up here, respiratory center to control the activation of the muscles and different parts that you need in order to inhale and exhale. And there are centers for swallowing and all kinds of centers that are, and hearing as well, that are made possible by having specialized clusters of neurons deep down in the brainstem. So overall, the brainstem overall functions include receiving information from the skin and the muscles and the skeletal frame, of the body, of the head, and also the neck and the shoulder, because of the cranial nerves that come out of the brainstem. And also the brainstem provides motor control for the head musculature because it has a cranial nerve that goes out and controls movement of the shoulder. It's called cranial nerve number 11. But again, you do not need to get there. I just want to clarify. It enables us to relay sensory information that comes from below, from the spinal cord, to connect it with the rest of the brain, the cerebral cortex. And it also, so in addition to these two main functions, sensory channeling upward and motor channeling downward, we have, again, these clusters. And one of them is the reticular formation that I pointed out, like that worm coming down. And that is the major center for mediating arousal. When we say arousal in neurology, it means that the body is not sleeping. Arousal is being kind of the opposite of being asleep or being kind of hypoactive. And you add arousal, you add awareness, and you add alertness together, the three, and that gives you consciousness. knowing who you are, where you are oriented to your space, to your time, and you know where you are, and exactly, you just kind of feel yourself as a complete human being. So, but in order to regulate these functions, the reticular formation has connections with the frontal part of the brain. The brain goes down in the front and goes curves like this, and there's a center here that is connected with the reticular formation and other parts of the brain stem. And these also control the sleep cycle, sleep and wake cycle, the circadian rhythm. So some of these centers, because when you go back, you can see how the cranial nerves sprout out along the spinal cord. There are 12 on each side, called the cranial nerves. Some of these nerves control hearing, like the auditory nerve. It goes out of here, and it goes to the ears and connects with the inner ear. Balance is also the auditory nerve, the vestibular nerve, which also goes to the inner ear, and it controls your balance. If you have difficulty with that, you would be dizzy and have difficulty with the vestibular system. Taste, through having a cranial nerve or several cranial nerves that go into the tongue, and they control and they give you the ability to taste what you have. So these are functions, some of the sensory functions of the brain stem, because it has centers and nerves that actually mediate these functions: the hearing, balance, and taste. When we take the parts of the brain stem, we said the medulla is the lower part, then the pons on top, and on top of the pons is the midbrain. So looking at the medulla, it has several autonomic functions that you have no control over. These include digestion and regulating the movement, the stomach, movement, contractions, and breathing and heart rate. And simply, again, because it has these nuclei, as we call them, nuclei, that make these functions possible. Then the pons is the bridge. Pons in Greek means bridge. It connects the cerebellum with the rest of the brain. So you bring motor commands from the frontal part of the brain down to the cerebellum. And for example, in order to move something, like say your lips to say a word, you are going to send a signal with your intention, and the script that you make, the script of that movement that you make, goes down to the lips and to the larynx and to different parts of the 90 muscles that you activate in order to basically say that word. The cerebellum receives a copy of that script for movement. And also, the cerebellum communicates with the muscle, with the nerve that goes into the muscle to activate it. So it also has a copy of the actual physical activity as it is going on. So now it has two things. It has the original intention of your movement, and it has what is going on. And it calculates the difference. It kind of compares them to see if you are making any errors. And if you are making errors, it highlights them, it sends feedback to the areas that are moving your lips and other parts of speech, so that you can correct the movement while the movement is happening. So the cerebellum plays a big role in that. Motor learning, it plays a part in language and self-regulation. So again, this information is all the information that the cerebellum has. A lot of it goes through the pons. The midbrain, the part that's on top of the pons here, it coordinates sensory and motor functions, several sensory and motor functions. Sensory from the senses, and then motor functions, movement. These include particularly eye movement. Eyes can move up and down, vertical. Eyes can move sideways, and eyes can move at an angle like this or like that, laterally. All of these, every movement has a set of muscles that control that, and nerves. And also, the midbrain has two centers. I'm gonna, tell you about. So here's one center. It's called the inferior colliculus. That center is for auditory processing. And when we speak about hearing, I'm going to speak about how this area enables us to calculate distance of sound, to enable us to localize sound, to see where the sound is coming from, because that's a survival mechanism. And then this information comes from the auditory pathways that are below, and it goes to the superior colliculus, that area that is part of the brain stem. And that piece enables you to take your auditory information, combine it with your facial movements and your eyes. So when you hear a sound, you immediately turn your head toward it, turn your eyes toward it, and you localize the sound, and you determine if you need to run away, if you need to stop where you are, if you need to move, whatever it is that you need to. So it has social functions, and it has survival functions as well. So that is just an example of what the midbrain does. You could see again here how the midbrain has, these two big cables that connect the brain above the rest of the brain with the spinal cord below, and you have another one on the other side. The structure that's on top of the midbrain is called the thalamus, and you have, there's an extension out of it that gives rise to some visual nerves. So this is when we say midbrain, it allows the coordination of visual and auditory reflexes. This is what I mean when I explained how when sound localization is completed, that information is fed into the superior colliculus, and it allows you to have the auditory reflex. You hear a sound, immediately turn your head toward that sound, and that is the auditory, a kind of auditory reflex that results from the integration of visual and auditory information. The cerebellum. So just again to recap, the brainstem mostly has to do with autonomic nervous system functions that enable us to survive, and with channeling the information from sensory mechanisms and the spinal cord up to the cortex, and bringing in or being a cable that allows transfer of information from the cortex to the lower parts of the body. So motor, sensory, and autonomic nervous system functions. The cerebellum, I added a couple of pictures here. I hope they don't throw you off, but the same slides you have are the ones that I'm using. I just add a couple of pictures. I think instead of going back and forth, I find it easier to kind of have an image on the spot. So the cerebellum contributes to fine motor skills. The cerebellum is a miniature brain, and it actually has centers that are very similar to the centers of the cerebral cortex. There are memory centers, language centers, emotional centers, and all, you can, and moreover, these centers in the cerebellum are connected with the cerebral cortex. In a way, as the cerebellum has a right hemisphere or a left hemisphere. It has its own cortex. So the right side of the cerebellum, the right hemisphere of the cerebellum, connects with the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, where we have basic language centers and so on. The left hemisphere of the cerebellum connects with the right hemisphere of the cortex of the brain, whereby we have a lot of emotional processing happening and other functions. So the cerebellum, again, as I mentioned before, it contributes to correcting motor actions, helping us identify errors, and giving feedback to the areas that have the intention and areas that do the movement, so that information can enable us to correct our movements as we are performing them. Enables us to modify the force and the range of the movement, so that when we want to do something, we go smoothly. And it has connections, of course, with the cerebrum, especially the frontal part and the areas that move. And if that channel is severed, for example, the control of the frontal part of the brain, the motor centers are severed from other parts, that could contribute to cerebral palsy. The cerebellum is critical for motor learning. You want to learn dancing, you have to use the cerebellum, rely on it. Anything that has sequential movements, karate, anything that has sequential movements, any sport, you cannot do it without having an intact cerebellum. For example, Tiger Woods, at age 5, they started, training him to play golf. And as he would play and play and play, the cerebellum would be sculpted, will be more skilled. The cerebellum is also important for cognitive functions and for language functions. I had a student a few years ago, not several, who had a cerebellar tumor, and she would have to go to the hospital every 6 months to have a surgery, and where they kind of take that, piece of the tumor that grows, and they take it out every 6 months. And this student had almost moderate to severe language problems. You wouldn't imagine in the cerebellum, but the fact is that her socialization was impacted. She had difficulty interpreting people's intentions. She had difficulty expressing herself, the tone of voice, and adequately, and a lot of communication problems that she had as a result of having that cerebellar tumor. So the cerebellum is very important. It has not many people understand what the research says about it today, unfortunately, but it is a major structure that is going to help us understand children's fine motor skills and children's language and social skills. Okay, perhaps at this point you could pause the video and take a little break, stretch for a few minutes, and then come back. I just didn't want to break the material into 2 pieces, but it will make it easier to upload the video. But please do it so that every half hour or 45 minutes, just take a break from studying, do something else, and come back. So now we move to the two structures that are together called the diencephalon. The first one is the thalamus, and the second one is the hypothalamus. Thalamus simply means chamber. So here it is. Here's the brainstem, and on top of it you have these two structures that are the size of a bird's egg, each one of them. And when you look laterally, the lateral view, you are going to see that little extension in here that goes down, and then it has two little pieces down here, and then you have a gland. So that extension is the hypothalamus. If you can just imagine taking that, this tail out of here, and just can imagine that piece that extends from the thalamus down to form these two structures, this is the hypothalamus. And what you have here below, literally, it isn't a piece of the brain. It doesn't have neurons to do things and think. And it is the pituitary gland it serves as a storage place, as a pouch for the hypothalamus to store its hormones and its secretions. It stores them in the pituitary gland. So we'll speak about it a little bit about the thalamus and the thalamus and hypothalamus, but we are not going to go too much. We'll just stick to what relates to us, pertains to us. As you could see, the thalamus sits right in the core of the brain. When you refer to the two sides, we say the thalamic nuclei, and a nucleus is a cluster of neurons, cell bodies of neurons, that resides deeper. It resides below, away from the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex has more than 80% of the bodies of the neurons. That makes it gray in color. This is why we call it the gray matter. So when you find bodies of neurons below the cerebral cortex, it becomes kind of odd. So we call these bodies, particularly that do not exist in the cerebral cortex, we call them nuclei. One is a nucleus, and sometimes we call them bodies, and sometimes we call them ganglia. So you have these different names in anatomy because of how we have some Greek terms, we have some Latin terms, we have some terms from other languages. So the thalamus is a major gating center of the nervous system. Sensory information comes in and it goes to the thalamus, and it gets refined and modified, and then it is sent to different parts of the brain to be processed further. I can give you just one example of the thalamus. What the thalamus does. Let's go back to this area. So this is the thalamus. There is a structure of the thalamus that is called the medial geniculate nucleus, or the medial geniculate body. The auditory pathways, if you look here, nerve number 8, this nerve, out of it, we have the ascending auditory pathways that bring information from the ears up, and then one major cable from these pathways goes into the inferior colliculus here. And then the information from that inferior colliculus, then it branches out, it is sent to the superior colliculus, and then most of the other information goes to the thalamus, this area. Sometimes we call it the auditory thalamus. Now, suppose you are in a party, and there's a lot of noise, and people are talking and chattering. and then you are listening to someone, and the noise makes it hard for you to hear. The thalamus takes that information as it comes into it, and it gates it so that it can amplify the signal up to 100 times, so that it becomes optimal, and then it sends it to the auditory cortex above, and the cortex which is above your ears. So if the signal is very loud, and all of this area could dampen it, could kind of suppress it down, lower its volume, so that it wouldn't be overwhelming for you. I had a student many years ago who had seizures. He was quite bright and did very well. However, his seizures just made it hard for him academically. And he would be annoyed if there's loud noise, or if someone speaks, a little bit louder. He would feel very agitated. And his doctor would give him these moldable earplugs, and so that he could plug his ears, so he could, kind of reduce the overstimulation from the hearing while he's working on exams and stuff like that. So one of the major problems for this young man was that the thalamus was not gating right. So he had difficulty gating sensory stimuli as they were coming in, signals. He would see them as too loud, or if they were indeed too loud, the thalamus wouldn't kind of suppress them and make them manageable for him. Many people with autism would have very tough time regulating and actually gating sensory signals, and they become simply overwhelmed. So this is just an example of how the thalamus serves as a gating mechanism for sensory information. The hypothalamus is primarily an autonomic nervous system piece. It enables us to do things that we have no control over. It contributes, for example, to how much urine we release. As it has a hormone, vasopressin, we call it the antidiuretic hormone. For example, it produces it. This antidiuretic hormone, from the name, it means against releasing urine. So when your body, the hypothalamus has sensors inside of your blood vessels. When your body, when these sensors sense that there isn't enough fluid in your bloodstream, that the blood is becoming more acidic, it is going to give you a signal that you are thirsty. It gives you a signal that it wants to do something, so you can first add more water into your bloodstream, and second, to prevent more water from going out into the bladder. So it would, in a case when you kind of reach that stage of dehydration, then the antidiuretic hormone is released, and it is going to decrease the rate of flow of the fluid through the kidneys. It will prevent the kidneys from taking as much water out of the blood as it goes through the kidneys, and then as a result, it causes the urine to be concentrated, to be very dark, So the color is going to tell you how much water you basically need, but it gives you the signal that to trigger your thirst. Another function, for example, is appetite. Your stomach is very innervated. It has it is a very strong muscle. And it is one of the structures that receives a lot of blood supply. Like if you are sitting down for an hour or two, for example, and not moving, 40% of your blood is going to accumulate around the stomach area, around your waist. And for this reason, I'm asking you to take that break, stand up, move left, right, do something, and redistribute that blood so your brain can get its fair share. So the hypothalamus has connections with the stomach, walls of the stomach, and the nerves that innervate the muscles of the stomach, and with that piece of the stomach that is connected with the intestine, the duodenum. And for example, as you are sitting down and eating, if you eat very quickly, your stomach expands quickly, and before the signal goes from the stomach to the hypothalamus, to the rest of the brain to say, you are starting to be full, you should not be eating anymore. But if you eat and speak, take your time, have small bites, and make it kind of, eating slowly and having more time, then that will give the signal from your stomach to go to the brain to say, oh, you are starting to extend to that particular limit. When the extension of the stomach is going to reach that particular limit gradually. So be ready. Now you are starting to feel almost full. You could maybe take a bite or two, but by that time, when that reaches that usual extension, then you stop and say, I am done. I can't eat anymore. So these are ways to trick to make your brain kind of do the work it does. People who eat very quickly, especially if they eat and they drink cold drinks while they're eating, the cold drinks are going to cause contractions of the stomach, very quick contractions, and the stomach will empty and you're hungry. I need more. And the opposite is true. When you have a warm liquid as you are eating, it relaxes the walls of the stomach. It makes it digest kind of more slowly, and it gives you a chance then to send the signal to say, I am starting to fill up, and you wouldn't have eat more. So the hypothalamus regulates sexual functions, sexual hormones, maturation hormones that are, transform a little boy into a man, that transform a little girl into a woman physically, the sexual hormones and reproduction hormones, lactation, like when, the mother, for example, someone who has a child at home, a baby, and she is, that baby is, say, 6 or months or 7 months, and he's at home with his grandparents, and the mother goes out to the store, and then she hears a baby crying. What happens in the phenomenon is that the mother starts to lactate, even though that's not her baby. But that signal activates the hypothalamus, and that hypothalamus begins to make the mother lactate with that particular signal. So primarily, the hypothalamus has autonomic functions, and one of these functions that it is very important in is it contributes to the fight or flight phenomenon or response, as it communicates with the adrenal cortex to make it release more adrenaline, so that you will be ready to fight or to run, to do something. So now let's kind of recap quickly. We have the brainstem, medulla, pons, and midbrain. On top of the brainstem, we have the diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, everything else that wraps around these structures is the cerebrum. Everything else. So, the cerebrum generally has gray matter and it has white matter. And inside of the white matter, it has some clusters of cell bodies that are specialized in doing certain functions. And these are the ones I told you. These are the structures that are called nuclei or ganglia or bodies simply. So the cerebrum is made out of, or it forms two hemispheres, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and the layer, the very top outermost layer of the cerebrum, the layer that is convoluted and all this, that's basically the gray matter, is about 4 millimeters, which is a couple of about 2 fractions of an inch in thickness. Yet, it is the most critical piece of the brain. And it is what makes a difference between a human being and another animal. The grooving, how deep the grooves are, how elevated the gyri are, that contributes to how efficient the brain is. For example, in some areas, people with autism do not have very deep grooves, and they don't have elevated gyri in the curving pieces of the cerebral cortex. And that obviously contributes to their difficulties. So the very outermost layer of the brain, that is the cerebral cortex, and then beneath you have the white matter, and then inside you have these clusters of neurons that are there. Some of them are the basal ganglia, and then you have the hippocampus and the amygdala or the amygdaloid nucleus. Some of these names might be familiar with you, but I'm going to go over basic functions again. And then you can write a book on each one of these, but we just want to have a quick overview to give you a background so that when we begin speaking about the development, then it makes more sense. So here's the cerebral cortex, on top, and the area that is elevated like a mountain is called gyrus. 2 or more of these are called gyri. And then the areas that are, deep as valleys or fissures, they are either called fissures or sulci. One is called the sulcus. If it is too deep, it becomes fissure, like the longitudinal fissure here, for example, that separates right hemisphere from left hemisphere. That's called the longitudinal fissure. There is a line here, quite a deep line in the center here, that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal here. That's called the central fissure, or the central sulcus sometimes. So a fissure can be either a sulcus or a fissure, and more than 2 or more of it are called sulci. And then deeper in the white matter, as you could see, these structures here, for example, this one, this one, they are called basal ganglia. Basal is almost like near the root, so deep in the brain, and ganglia means, ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies that is located out of the cerebral cortex. You can see the thalamus deep there behind the basal ganglia. Here's another image that shows the basal ganglia, particularly which is the putamen and the caudate, and then there are some other structures. There are 5 in all, but I just want you to just know them as a group. What do they do? Because they relate to things that we are interested in. This is a coronal view. So if you cut this way, you make a front piece of the face and the back piece of the face. Then you could see this cut. Here is the longitudinal fissure. That is the split between the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. And then you have a corpus callosum that connects the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere. And then you have, you could see the thalamic nuclei. Oh. All right. The thalamic nuclei here. So, and this is another view of the basal ganglia. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 here. So the basal ganglia, generally, the functions of the basal ganglia, there are 3 major functions. The basal ganglia are in the core, like in the center of the brain, and they have connections with different parts of the cerebral cortex, and also connections with lower parts of the brain. So one function is to regulate social communication skills. Like as I'm interacting with you, I need to focus on what you are saying. I need to watch your facial expressions in response to what I am saying. Am I saying something that makes you laugh, or something that makes you happy, upset or angry, and so on? And also I watch the context. Am I standing in the middle of the way and blocking people's path? And I watch a lot of you physically, and focus on what you say, focus on what I am saying, making sure that what you say and what I say are connected. We are speaking about the same topic, that I am not saying something contradicting what I just said, that I am not saying something that is gonna clash with what you are saying. A lot of things go into communication, and the basal ganglia has a major pathway that connects the brain, a frontal part of the brain, with the memory center and emotional center, and other parts communication, so that we can have effective social communication abilities. Another function is to regulate movement. For example, how much force should I put if I'm playing, say boxing, and I am, punching? How much force should I put? I am pulling something. How far how strongly should I pull? How much energy? So it regulates the force of the movement, and it also enables us to have fine motor skills. Ask me to make a circle, I'm gonna make it like, in a smooth way, not like, so if that pathway between the frontal lobe of the brain and the basal ganglia is severed or is malfunctioning, the person will have cerebral palsy. This is why cerebral, from the cerebral cortex. And palsy is like that rigidity of muscles. And another function, so we have regulation of language, social communication and interpersonal skills, regulation of movement, and also regulation of emotions and motivation. These areas, the basal ganglia, they use dopamine, and dopamine is the mechanism for, the neurotransmitter for movement, for motivation, for emotions, and there's also serotonin. So if there's an abnormality in the dopamine level, the person could have movement-related problems like Parkinson's. And guess what they give them as a medication? Dopamine. They give them L-Dopa. So it's a kind of giving them dopamine because they have difficulty circulating and producing it. And also, people who have depression, you look for these areas, the basal ganglia, and you look for how neurotransmitters are circulated and how much neurotransmitter there is, how much dopamine they produce, and that is going to have an effect on their mood, anxiety. So then generally looking at the cerebrum with the gray matter, white matter, the clusters in between, we look at the structure that makes us human beings, especially the cortex. We have 4 lobes. Everyone knows what they are, but not many people, know that there are actually 6 structures of the cerebral cortex. So, but generally, the functions are cognitive functions, emotional functions, language functions, sensory functions, motor functions. These are the things that make us human beings. Let's first look at we said the amygdala. We look at the amygdala and the hippocampus. We now looked at the basal ganglia, and after that we'll look at the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex itself. So the amygdala, as you could see it here, next to the hippocampus, the amygdala is connected with the basal ganglia. The amygdala is your fear processing center, and it is basically your emotional processing center. People with autism, some studies show that people with autism have a hypersensitive amygdala. They have an enlarged amygdala in many cases. And based on that, the emotional response is overwhelming. They just have difficulty controlling it. It is responsible for looking for fear signals in people's faces and the environment, constantly scanning everything to make sure that you are emotionally adjusted in the environment that you have. And that is a source of anxiety if the amygdala is hyperactive or is there something that causes a concern or anxiety. The amygdala is the center to process the information. And also the amygdala, in addition to processing, it actually has the control to activate the hippocampus. That hippocampus here is your memory processing center. And I highlight processing. Hippocampus does not store memories for long term. It processes. Like when you get your mail, it goes to a mail processing center where the mail goes on a belt, and based on the code, your code that you have is going to be scanned, and that letter or package is going to go into a particular route, and it will go into a basket, and then it goes to the mail truck based on the code that's on it, the barcode. So by the end of the day, there's no mail, basically. But the hippocampus is connected to all senses, and all the information you get has to go to the hippocampus to be processed, to be sorted out, to be tagged in terms of importance. How important is that information? I need to make it accessible more frequently. I'm going to have it sent to be stored in this particular area. And how this is a low priority kind of information. Let's put it there and here. So it sorts out information, and within about an hour or so, it begins to initiate storage of that information. It works with the frontal part of the brain here, so that it sends the information back and forth, basically, presumably, to decide what information to keep, what information to discard. And it is also connected with all the sites, all the storage sites for the information storage. The information storage is in the cortex, that very thin layer, that 4 millimeter layer that is the cerebral cortex. That is the place where we store everything. So the hippocampus is connected with all these storage sites, and it has pathways, and it sends information to be stored there. But generally, as you are in contact with information, for example, you are looking at something initially, that information is being processed, received initially and processed in the visual cortex, in the back of your head. Then it is fed into the hippocampus. And the hippocampus takes it and sorts it out, and it works with the frontal part of the brain to determine, make a decision. Should I keep this there? Should I, and where should I store it? And then that information, when it is sorted out, it will be shipped back to the visual cortex to be stored for life. And you want to retrieve it. For example, you say, let's think about, imagine a tree now. In order to imagine a tree, you go to the hippocampus, and it will activate the pathway to the visual cortex, and it's going to make you see a tree in your mind. So it's a processing center for information that comes in that we need to retain, to store and retain, and an information processing center for information that we need to recall, that we need to retrieve. But the hippocampus does not store information for good. The amygdala, or the amygdaloid body, or the amygdaloid nucleus, all are the same, the name for the same structure. As I mentioned, it has the power to activate the hypothalamus, to actually make it put importance on certain pieces of information. This is why anything emotional, you have a tough time forgetting it. It stays with you, and you remember a lot that is going on that might not be related to the emotion itself. However, because whenever the amygdala is activated, the hippocampus is activated. And at that moment, anything that comes along, you are going to store it. This is why, again, things that are emotionally loaded are going to have a higher significance in terms of, recalling and storing and so on. So this is what we will come back to this, I'm sure, many times, but now we look at the cerebral cortex itself, and the cerebral cortex consists of 4 lobes. We know them named after the bones of the, sorry, that thing keeps popping up, it's annoying. Named after the bones of the skull. The frontal bone covers the frontal lobe of the brain, the parietal bone covers the parietal lobe, and the occipital bone covers the occipital lobe. The temporal bone covers the temporal lobe. So these are 4. However, there's another lobe that is buried. If you open up the lateral fissure, then you find an island there that is called the insula. The insula mediates a function that we know as the brain default mechanism that enables you to feel your emotions in your gut. It enables you to somatize your emotions. When you are not feeling well and you start to feel like, butterflies in your stomach, or you feel, or someone says something's bad and you feel like as if you are kicked in the stomach, that is the area that makes you feel that. It also enables you to have intuition. It connects with different pieces of the different parts of the cerebral cortex, and it enables you to kind of have that intuition something is going to happen or someone is going to behave in a certain way based on pieces of information that are scattered around. However, there is no obvious connection that you could see consciously, but the insula or insular cortex calculates and connects these pieces together, and it gives you information to say as a background, this based on these pieces, that could be what is going to happen. And if your knowledge is accurate and you don't have a lot of things that are not based on myths or things, your intuition could be actually accurate. The insula is also a major component that contributes to verbal production, moving your muscles of speech to verbalize, and it is connected to language centers as well. So, and it also contributes to emotions such as love and expressions of intimacy and so on. So we have looked at the cerebrum, we have looked at the cerebral cortex generally, and looked at the basal nuclei, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. I wanted to mention just in one sentence functions of the lobes. I'm sure these are basic functions you all know, but the frontal lobe itself, this is has all the centers for movement, controlling the movement. It has the motor cortex that enables us to move anything that we have in the body. And it has motor planning areas. And the very far front area here, that's called the prefrontal cortex. That is your self-regulation center. It is your executive control center. It has work and memory functions. It has your decision making, your intentions, your planning. It is the part that runs the entire body, that regulates basically the functions that we do. You want to initiate a task, you want to get up and get a glass of water, that is your area that makes you come up, connect your emotions and however you are feeling with your plans for the future, with your goals, so that you can develop goals and actually move your body or move muscles or whatever to react to whatever is happening around you or inside of you. So that's the frontal lobe. And then the parietal lobe has a sensory map of the entire body. And so it enables you to have sensations from different all different parts of your body. And it enables you to, for example, as you move your hand or any part, you are going to have a sensation of that movement. It gives you what is known as sometimes the sixth sense, that is proprioception. Proprioception. That's information from your joints and your muscles in terms of how they are moving, how they are adjusted in space, and that is quite an important motor feedback mechanism. It is the center that facilitates writing and the integration of reading with written language. If you say, for example, you want to find your keys in the dark, and then you just go and what you do is you are feeling with your finger centers here. And when you find the keys, even though you do not see them, your sensory centers here on your toes, on your fingers and on your thumb, they are going to read the information. I'm going to ask you to do an experiment. You'll find it maybe funny. If you have someone hold their hand out like this, close their eyes, hold their hand, and you tell them, I'm going to put something in your hand, you tell me what it is without doing anything. You just keep your hand flat and you put, say, a dime or a quarter here. There is no way for them to read that information, to know what you put on their hand. There is no way on earth to do that. So when you put it there, and immediately if you say, now keep your eyes closed, you can tell me what it is, they immediately will bring their fingertips in touch with the information. And once they do that, they are now able to read that information and will say, oh, I'm holding a penny, and they kind of manipulate things between their fingertips because they have sensory centers that can read the information. The visual cortex has visual functions, enables us to process, things that we see. And it has centers as you go from bottom to top, areas for processing slow motion and areas that are processing fast motion. And then the temporal cortex, that is the primary center for auditory processing and the primary center for memory and for emotions. Why? Because the amygdala and the hippocampus are buried deep inside of this temporal cortex. So emotions and memory, and you have auditory information. So we are going to speak about these functions as we go, especially when we speak about auditory processing and how it shapes the brain and its functions and so on. One thing that I'm going to mention is about hemispheric lateralization. We have right hemisphere, left hemisphere. The ideas are that, yes, there are fundamental centers in the left hemisphere, fundamental basic centers. We call them elementary centers in the left hemisphere that mediate language functions. For example, syntax, how you make sentence patterns. We call these sentence patterns grammar. Syntax is in the left hemisphere. The mental lexicon, the dictionary that you have, the words they have in your mind are in the left hemisphere. When you process, say someone is saying something, and then your information, what you are seeing in front of you and what you know, show that there's a discrepancy between what the speaker's intention is, and what that speaker is saying. Basically, lying. So you analyze this, and it doesn't make sense. This is your intention, and this is what you are saying. That doesn't make sense. And so, detection of lies, detection of inaccuracies, it is the analytical side. The right hemisphere is more dominant for looking at things in a global way. So I'll give you an example. When you hear a sentence, you hear a word, say cat. You get the meaning here, sounds are assembled, and then you pair the meaning and you get the concept of cat. Say the cat is walking. There's nothing about that, nothing hard to process. So that is mostly dominantly processed in the left hemisphere. But to visualize the cat, to imagine it walking, to imagine its texture, its, how it feels and so on, you need to get input from the right hemisphere to add the context. Now, when you say, it is raining cats and dogs, immediately the left hemisphere is going to start to be activated, and it wants to show you cats and dogs literally falling from the sky. This is what the left hemisphere would have you do. But the right hemisphere is going to say, no, you keep your networks here, just suppress them and let my voice be heard. And the right hemisphere comes, no, you look at the whole picture, look at the entire sentence as a piece. There is nothing falling from the sky. And then it gives you the meaning, the abstract meaning. And so then you move from one sentence to a paragraph. Then the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that looks at the whole paragraph and says, well, the whole idea of this paragraph is. So you look at a whole story or a whole narrative or conversation. It gives you the whole kind of look at something from a contextual point. You can't process information just in one hemisphere. You have to rely on both of them to have a complete understanding and complete way of processing information. So while we have these elementary centers for basic functions, whether in the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, these centers work in networks, and these networks are in right and left, and you can't necessarily say this person is a right hemisphere person and this person is a left hemisphere person. These ideas are not valid anymore, because the left hemisphere does particular functions and the right hemisphere does particular functions. When you combine them together, you have a whole, like a really normal functioning. What is the value if we were to have the left hemisphere do exactly what the right hemisphere does? There will be redundancy. There will be, why do you need to have everyone working on the same thing when you can have people working on different functions and sharing together and giving that whole product in the end as a complete product? But the commercialization of left hemisphere, right hemisphere, make an exam for this these people, and it was abused, these concepts, and based on misunderstanding, where you have all these kinds of conclusions. This person is more right hemisphere. These again are not valid anymore, and they are myths. And in order for any part of the brain to function, it must work as part of a circuit. And the circuit works, covers a huge area. For example, if you want to say a single word, it activates about 55% of the brain. One single word. So, another way is the right hemisphere is more dominant for emotional processing. For example, I'll give you an example. I'm almost done. You say, something, you want to express yourself. You hear someone saying, what? When you hear that, you need to go to the right hemisphere so that the right hemisphere can take that tone of voice and analyze it and say, what is that person's intention? What are they telling me with their tone of voice? Is that person angry? Is that person agitated? Is that person happy? Is that person joking? So you analyze that in the right hemisphere. A special area does that. Now you want to do the same. You want to reply and you quote something in your tone of voice. The right hemisphere gives you that ability to match your tone of voice with the right, with the right words. Or with the words, match them with the right tone of voice. So, but how can you do this if you don't have access to the actual raw material of the actual words and the utterances? So the two hemispheres have to work together, and we cannot just go and say, these old ideas about right and left hemispheres and the divisions. But we look at these areas as elementary areas that function within circuits. And if parts of the circuit are disrupted, significant parts, the circuit could fall apart. Or if one member of the circuit is not able to do the function, the whole circuit is able to compensate, and you wouldn't notice the absence of that person. That's the beauty of using networks and circuits in the brain. So that brings to conclusion the overview of the nervous system, and I'm going to make a quiz, and it will be posted on Blackboard in the next day or two. And thank you. Email me with any questions. Thank you.